in my life and in your life, we have two major components. We have what we expect or our expectations of that relationship. We have a time that we expect that our spouse will come home from dinner. We have an expectation about how our children will behave when they're away from home. We have a level of expectation about how our parents will interact with our children if we have small kids. With a friend, we have expectations of what they'll do with that secret that we share with them. With a roommate, we have expectations about how they'll interact with us as it pertains to the cleanliness of our apartment. We have expectations in our relationships, but we also have what we experience. There's our expectations and what we experience. Maybe you expect that spouse to come home by a certain time, and then day after day after day, they don't show up on time. There's this gap between what we expect in the relationship and what we experience in the relationship. And in reality, some relationships, that gap is small. When I think about my wife, Stacy, she's one of the most trustworthy people I've ever met in my life. And there's a very small gap. But there are other relationships in my life and in our lives where that gap is pretty big. Maybe even that gap can keep going out this way so far that, it's, almost impossible to repair what has been broken. But there is a solution. In fact, here's what I want us to hear. When there is a gap in any relationship in my life, I make a choice, you make a choice, what to put in that gap. And there are two things that we can put in there. The first one is that I can put trust in the gap. And the second one is that I can put suspicion in the gap. I make a choice, you make a choice, we make a choice what to put in that gap. Either we assume the worst or we believe the best. And as you can imagine, trust is always protecting, always persevering, always hoping, always believing the best. Now, the question, obviously, that all of us are wrestling through is what to do when that gap is wide and when it continues over and over and over and over and over again. How do I respond when what I expect and what I experience consistently are separated by this major gap? Let me say it like this. With my son, Cademan, who is now 6 years old, and 2 years ago, my wife, Stacy, and I, as we were in the process of adopting our youngest son, Sammy, she went over to Ethiopia for 9 days in the process of bringing him home. I was kind of like a bachelor with Cademan at home for those 9 days. We were eating ramen noodles and peanut butter and jelly for dinner. We were on this really weird routine. He would sleep for like 3 hours in the afternoon from 2:30 to 5:30, and I would get work done, and I just let him sleep, which necessitated that he would go to sleep at like 10:30 at night because he wasn't tired at his normal bedtime, and I was okay with it. I was working fine for me until Saturday night, which is obviously the night before we have our services the next day. And so I'm really struggling. What do I do? And I put him in his bed. He keeps getting out. I threaten him. You know how we all give the threat. If you get out one more time. Well, finally, I just had to go to sleep, and he was still awake in his bed. The next morning, somebody from South Bay comes over to do the handoff so that I can go over to the services and preach the message. And that person comes to me and says, hey, I noticed something looks a little bit weird about Cademan's face and his hair. I take Cademan home that afternoon. I go to put him in bed, and when I go to put him in bed, I notice that there are some scissors in his bed. There's a book bag in his bed which has been shred to pieces by the scissors, and there's hair everywhere. How am I going to fill that with trust? How am I going to believe the best? Oh, Cademan, I just figured that you probably just wanted a haircut, right? So you just went in the, that's fine, that's cool if that's what you want to do. Here's the truth and the reality. When I cannot choose to trust, when there is a gap, I must confront the situation. When I cannot choose to trust, I must choose to confront. There must be some logical explanation, Cademan, behind why you deemed it necessary to wake up after I had fallen asleep and to get the scissors and cut your hair. Please help me understand why it happened this way. In any situation in our lives, whether it's a spouse that takes the credit card and instead of living within the budget, they go to the mall and they return with 7 shopping bags from Neiman Marcus and Louis Vuitton, or it's a friend of ours that continually disappoints us with failing to come through on appointments or times that we're supposed to be together, or a teenager that breaks the boundary of when we've said that they need to walk through the door at the end of the day, or a person that we're dating that continues to cheat on us. All of these instances, when there is a gap and I cannot make the choice to trust, I must make the choice to confront. But we don't do that, do we? Our natural tendency is to, did you hear what Sally did? Oh my gosh, I can't believe her. She never keeps a promise. Oh, I'm gossiping about Sally now. Did you hear about Mark, who doesn't do his job? He never comes through. Now I am filling in that gap not just with suspicion, but with gossip. So there are commitments that I can make when there is a gap in any relationship. And if you're taking notes, here are the commitments that we can make. Number one is this: when there is a gap between what I expect and what I experience, I will make a choice to fill that gap with trust. And until I can get to you, until I can talk to you about the situation, I'm going to make a choice to fill it with trust. Have you noticed that we as human beings are acceptance magnets? We don't tend to find ourselves drawn to people who are verbally and emotionally abusive to us. Maybe we get stuck in a relationship like that, but look at even many high schoolers. That the reason that so many kids who are in high school deviate from the path that leads to life and joy is because there's this group of people in their school that loves them and accepts them, and there are all these behaviors that are associated with those people that love them and accept them. We don't have a tendency to rise to the occasion when somebody is suspicious of our behavior. Have you noticed when someone comes to investigate you and blame you and assumes the worst about you, what is the natural tendency? It's to be defensive. It's to explain your behavior in a defensive manner. We need to make the choice in every relationship when there is a gap to automatically believe the best until we can get to that person. The second one is this: when I catch someone filling the gap with suspicion, I will come to your defense. When I catch someone filling the gap with suspicion, I will come to your defense. Instead of engaging in a gossip loop about you, I will come directly to you, but in the middle of that conversation, I will defend you until I can clear it up and understand what it was that produced this gap between what I expect and what I experience. And then, lastly, but certainly not least, is if what I experience or see begins to erode my trust, I will come directly to you. The quickest way to break the cycle of mistrust in any relationship, the quickest path is to go directly to that person. Because what happens to us when we assume the worst, we build out the worst case scenario in our minds. I did this earlier in my marriage. Remember, I said the challenge for us is what I expect and what I see, what I see and who I am. I have some areas of my past from being abandoned and struggles that affected my marriage initially, and it made it difficult for me when my wife would be at work late as a teacher and I'd call and I couldn't get a hold of her on the phone and I didn't know where she was. That gap began to affect my trust, but I would assume the worst until I realized she's an extremely trustworthy person and I need to come directly to her when there is a gap and solve it as quickly as possible. Could you imagine in every relationship in your life, if just this week you had made these three choices? The choice, number one, when there's a gap, to put trust in that gap. Number two, when you catch someone filling that gap with something else, with suspicion, to come to the defense of that person. And then when something happens which erodes your trust, to go directly to that person. This would begin the process of healing, and the cycle of trust could begin to move in the right direction. But there's a second component of this, which we will not camp quite as long. Not only do we need to trust, but we need to become more trustworthy. We need to become the kind of person that closes the gap in the relationships of our lives.